Have you ever tried to tell someone the truth about themselves, only to watch them wave it away because they'd already made up their mind, because the story they'd decided was true was more comfortable than the one you were offering, and no amount of actual evidence was going to dislodge it? Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to build the largest empire the world had ever seen, to connect 23 nations under a single administration, to write a declaration saying that conquered peoples had the right to worship their own gods and live under their own customs, to build a road so well engineered that couriers could cross 2,000 miles in a week, and then watch history remember you as the villain, because the people who wrote the history books were the people on your western border who lost a few battles and never got over it. And they were, it must be said, very, very good writers. Have you ever stopped to consider that the word paradise, the English word, the one you use for tropical islands and perfect afternoons, and the afterlife itself, is a Persian word, borrowed from Old Persian paradisa, meaning a walled garden, meaning a place where beauty is kept safe inside walls, meaning that the Persians thought gardens were so transcendent that the world needed a specific word just for them. And then asked yourself, what kind of civilization would build the world's first superpower, and decide that the thing worth naming was the garden? Because tonight, we are going to talk about the Persian Empire, the first true world power, a civilization so vast and so sophisticated that the Greek city-states it is mostly remembered for fighting, looked from the Persian perspective, roughly like regional franchise disputes on the western edge of the map. And we are going to find out who these people actually were, what they actually built, and why almost everything most of us think we know about them was written by the people who were most afraid of them. Hello and welcome back. I'm so glad you found your way here at whatever hour this is, in whatever arrangement you've made with your blanket and your pillow. This is Sleep Saga. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Tap the notification bell as well so these videos find you again. Because we are going to be here for a very long time. If you're enjoying this one, a like takes 2 seconds and means the world. Now, dim the room, get comfortable, and before we begin, if there's a candle near you or a small light you can turn low, do that, because tonight we're going into a world where fire means everything, and it's good to have a little of it nearby. Let's begin.
Let's set the scene. The year is somewhere around 600 BCE, and the world is older and more crowded and considerably more opinionated than you might expect. The Near East, that wide arc of land and river and mountain running from the Nile Delta to the Indus River, is not empty. It is not undiscovered. It is not waiting for someone to arrive and explain civilization to it. It is already deeply civilized, full of people who have been building cities and writing things down and arguing about grain prices for literally thousands of years, and who have the architectural receipts to prove it. To the west, Egypt. Ancient even then, imperial even then, a civilization so long-lived that when Cleopatra was born, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already 2,500 years old, which is to say that Cleopatra is closer in time to us than she was to the people who built the structure she was born in the shadow of. That particular fact should stop you cold every time you encounter it, and yet it never quite does. Egypt floods, farms, and builds enormous things, and it has been doing this for so long that it is mildly bored by newcomers. To the north and east, the Assyrian Empire has recently and dramatically collapsed. Circa 612 BCE, the fall of Nineveh, the whole arrangement, and this has created a power vacuum that everyone in the neighborhood finds slightly alarming. The Assyrians were not loved. The Assyrians were, by the standards of even a relatively brutal ancient world, exceptional in their brutality. They deported entire populations. They built towers of skulls outside conquered cities as deliberate psychological messaging. They are the kind of ancient empire that makes historians write in the passive voice because it's slightly difficult to be matter-of-fact about towers of skulls. When they fell, there was relief throughout the region. There was also the immediate practical problem of, well, who runs things now? The answer, at the moment you've arrived in, is the Babylonians and the Medes, two powers who had worked together to bring the Assyrians down and who now find themselves awkwardly dividing up the former Assyrian territories like two people who've jointly cleared out a deceased relative's house and are standing in the living room, trying to appear casual about who gets the good furniture. Babylon is a city worth pausing on. Babylon sits on the Euphrates, fed by a web of canals that turn the surrounding desert into productive farmland. And it is enormous by the standards of any era before the Industrial Age. Possibly 250,000 people, possibly more, living inside walls so wide you could have driven a chariot along the top of them. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, which is genuinely debated. The earliest accounts of them appear centuries after they allegedly stood, and no archaeologist has found them would have been here, terraced and watered and fragrant above the city, like an architectural argument that beauty is worth the engineering investment. Babylon has temples and marketplaces and scribal schools, and a tradition of beer-making that the excavated tablets document with a thoroughness that suggests the Babylonians understood that civilization runs on grain and grain-derived products in roughly equal measure. The tablets record precise recipes. The tablets record prices. The tablets record complaints. The tablets record, in loving detail, every transaction involving every commodity, because Babylon understood from deep in its institutional bones that the true infrastructure of civilization is not monuments, it is paperwork. The Medes are to the east, in the high plateau region that corresponds roughly to northwestern Iran today. They are a confederation of Iranian-speaking tribes, semi-nomadic in recent memory, and newly settling into urban life, building their capital at Ecbatana, which sits up in the mountains at considerable altitude, and is, by all accounts, extremely cold in winter, and extremely well organized year-round. The Medes are related linguistically and culturally, and almost certainly genealogically, to a smaller group further south and east. The Persians, who live in a region called Parsa, in the folds and valleys of the southern Zagros mountains. The Persians, at this particular moment in history, are not impressive to anyone who is paying attention. They are a relatively minor group, nominally subject to Median overlordship, running their local affairs with competence and without causing anyone on the regional stage any particular concern. They keep cattle. They grow grain in the valley bottoms. They ride horses with the casual expertise of people who have been doing it since before memory. And in their courtyards and their temples, they tend small fires at stone altars, fires that are never allowed to go out, fires that represent, in the theology of their faith, the faith we would come to call Zoroastrianism, the presence in the world of the force of truth and right order. That fire, in the courtyard, the one that doesn't go out. We are going to come back to it all night across everything that follows. We are going to come back to it because it is the one constant in a story that is going to move very fast and cover a very long distance, and you will want something small and warm to orient yourself by. in the end, the world that looks so settled, so arranged, so distributed among its existing powers and existing certainties. And it does look settled. It has the deep stability of ancient systems doing what they have always done. The rhythms of flood and harvest and tribute and prayer cycling through their reliable circuits is about 5 decades away from the most dramatic reorganization the ancient world had ever seen. Because somewhere in the Persia region, on a farm, or in a small city, or in a cavalry training ground in the mountains, a child is growing up who has been watching how the world works. And who is, without quite knowing it yet, about to do something about it. The story hasn't started, but it's close. Let's talk about who the Persians were before they were the Persians, which sounds like one of those irritating philosophical riddles, but is actually just the kind of question history requires you to ask before it will tell you anything useful. The people who would become the architects of the world's first superpower descended from Indo-Iranian speaking populations who had been filtering into the Iranian plateau for centuries, part of a broad and still only partially understood migration of people from the Central Asian steppe, the great grassland highway of the ancient world, the highway that nobody named but everyone used. Moving horses and idas and languages and diseases westward and southward across multiple generations. By the time we can write about Proto-Persians with any confidence, they are living in the mountains and foothills of the southern Zagros range, organized into clans and tribes under local chieftains, farming the lower elevations and herding cattle and goats in the summer highlands, and practicing a religion that would, in its developed form, become one of the most influential faiths in human history. Zoroastrianism, named for the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, in the Greek transliteration that history adopted because history is like that. The dates of Zarathustra himself are disputed. Some scholars place him around 1500 BCE, some around 600 BCE. And the debate has enough moving parts that neither side has been conclusively wrong in over a century of argument, which is actually a sign of a healthy academic field. What we know is that by the time of the early Persian kings, Zoroastrian belief was deeply embedded in Persian identity. The universe is a cosmic battleground between Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the supreme creative deity, the force of truth and order and constructive fire, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the force of chaos and darkness, and the kind of institutional rot that causes empires to fall from the inside. Every human being, in every action of every day, makes a choice between these forces. The sacred fire, maintained in every household altar and every temple, never allowed to go out, representing the presence of Ahura Mazda in the physical world, is the most visible expression of this belief. It is also, if you think about it, one of the most practical pieces of theology ever devised. Keep a fire burning. It requires daily attention. It requires someone to be responsible. It requires, in its small domestic way, the exercise of exactly the virtues the faith asks for: care, continuity, faithfulness, the unglamorous work of maintenance. The Persians raised horses. The Zagros foothills were excellent horse country, and the horse was embedded so deeply in Persian culture that the three things a Persian nobleman was supposed to teach his son were riding horses, shooting a bow, and speaking the truth. Speaking truth. Right there in the ancient Persian educational program, as a core skill equivalent to cavalry training. Do not lie. The Zoroastrian moral framework showing up in what got taught to children, which is always the most honest indicator of what a civilization actually believed. They held feasts at which the host's status was demonstrated by the number and variety of dishes offered, because conspicuous generosity was how you announced your position in a society organized around reciprocal obligation. They hunted, both as sport and as military training. They organized themselves under a dynasty that traced its lineage to a semi-legendary ancestor called Achaemenid. The Achaemenians, the dynasty that would give the empire its formal name in the historical record. The Achaemenid Persian Empire. Before Cyrus, the Achaemenid kings are small figures. Tispes, Cyrus I, Cambyses I. Kings in the local sense, administrators of a mountain region, paying their Median tribute and managing their affairs without making any bid for larger power. They were building, generation by generation, the institutional capacity and the family alliances and the military organization that would eventually make what came next possible. But they did not know that. Nobody ever knows that they are building the thing that will change the world. It only looks that way from afterward. On a winter night in the Zagros foothills, in a household where the fire in the courtyard corner had been burning continuously for decades, a man named Cambyses I was ruling his small kingdom with the careful attention of a man who understood that careful attention was the work. His son was watching him do it. The son's name was Cyrus. He was paying very close attention. He would keep paying attention for the next several decades, through every military campaign and every administrative challenge, and every succession crisis, and every moment that history assigned to his era. And when the time came, he would act with the speed and precision of a man who had spent his entire previous life getting ready. That is one version of the story of Cyrus the Great. And it is probably the least romantic version. And it is probably the most true. Forget the legend. Here's the reality, which is, as it usually is with history, more interesting than the legend, though admittedly less tidy. The legend says Cyrus the Great was the grandson of the Median king Astyages, who received a prophetic dream that his daughter's son would overthrow him, who therefore tried to have the infant Cyrus killed, whose agent left the baby on a hillside where a shepherd found him and raised him as his own, and who discovered, years later, when the shepherd's apparently exceptional child kept getting noticed, that the shepherd had disobeyed and the grandson was alive and had grown into exactly the man the dream had warned about. This story appears in Herodotus with the narrative confidence of a man who has never met a detail he couldn't improve on. And you should apply to it roughly the same credibility you'd apply to any story that starts with "A king had a dream" that was actually a prophecy, and also a baby was left on a hillside. What we know with reasonable historical confidence is this: Cyrus II of Persia was the son of Cambyses I and a woman named Mandana, who was by various accounts related to the Median royal family, which would make Cyrus both Persian and Median by blood, and would also make his eventual conquest of Media something more complicated than a straightforward foreign invasion. He came to the Persian throne around 5 59 BCE. Probably in his 20s or early 30s. He was inheriting a vassal kingdom in the mountains of the southwest. And then, in approximately the following 11 years, he conquered Media, Lydia, and Babylon, which is roughly equivalent to being appointed regional manager, and then, by your mid-career, owning 3 of the largest conglomerates in the world, except the conglomerates were empires, and the acquisition process involved cavalry. Media came first, around 550 BCE. The details of the campaign are, as they tend to be with ancient military history, somewhat obscure. But the broad outline is this. Cyrus rebelled against Astyages, the Median king, and marched his army north into Median territory. The Median army, rather than fighting him, switched sides. Not captured, switched. The Median general Harpagus, who by some accounts had his own personal reasons for disliking Astyages, led much of the Median force over to Cyrus before the decisive engagement. Astyages was taken prisoner. And then Cyrus did the thing that would become his signature move. The move that made him genuinely different from every other conqueror of the ancient world. He did not punish the Median king. He kept him at court, treated him with the dignity appropriate to his former position, and absorbed the Median nobility into the Persian administration. The Medes did not experience this as defeat exactly. They experienced it as a change in management, one they could live with, because the new management was treating them well. Median nobles kept their positions. Median customs were respected. The new joint empire would be called the Medo-Persian Empire in some sources, which tells you something about how it felt from the inside. Not a conquest, but a merger. Lydia next. Lydia was the kingdom of Western Anatolia, roughly the western half of modern Turkey, ruled by Croesus, whose name has been synonymous with wealth for 2,500 years, which is the kind of posthumous legacy most people would kill for, and which Croesus would probably have preferred to trade for better judgment. Croesus was fabulously wealthy. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi about whether to attack Persia. The oracle told him that if he crossed the Halys River and attacked, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus interpreted this as a green light. Croesus crossed the river and attacked. Spoiler, The great empire that was destroyed was Lydia. The oracle, as always, was technically correct and specifically unhelpful. Cyrus captured Sardis, the Lydian capital, around 547 BCE. Croesus was taken prisoner. And here is the part that matters. Cyrus did not execute him. There is a story, again, probably improved by later telling, that Croesus was about to be burned alive, and Cyrus called off the execution at the last moment. Having been moved by something Croesus said about the wheel of fortune and the impermanence of human power, true or invented, or somewhere in between. The story reflects what Cyrus apparently did in practice. He kept Croesus, possibly as an advisor, and Croesus spent the rest of his life in the Persian court, which, by every account, was considerably more comfortable than being burned alive. This was not standard operating procedure for ancient world conquest. Ancient world conquest generally ended with the loser dead and the loser's people redistributed. Cyrus kept doing things that were not how ancient world conquerors generally behaved, which suggests either that he was a genuinely exceptional person by any era's standards, or that he had understood something about power that his predecessors had missed, namely, that destroying your enemies completely creates new enemies, whereas treating them well converts them into assets. Then Babylon. Babylon, 539 BCE. Babylon, the greatest city on earth, behind the widest walls in the ancient world, situated on a major river with defensive fortifications that military strategists of the period considered effectively impregnable. Babylon, which was considered by everyone in the ancient world who had an opinion on the matter to be absolutely impregnable. Spoiler: it was not. It fell to Cyrus in a manner that still generates academic debate and will probably always generate academic debate. According to Persian, Babylonian priestly, and Hebrew accounts, the city's defenses were compromised from within. The Babylonian army disengaged rather than fighting, and Cyrus entered Babylon as something much closer to a liberator than a conqueror. The priests of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, had grown bitterly disenchanted with the Babylonian king, Nabonidus, who had attempted to reorganize the religious calendar in ways they found personally insulting. Cyrus presented himself as Marduk's chosen agent. The priests decided they preferred Cyrus's version of events. And in the riverside market, a woman selling dates from a basket, a woman whose name we don't have, but whose life the archaeological and documentary record can reconstruct in its outlines. A woman of middle age who had survived a change of administration already, and who understood from long experience that markets continued regardless of who was king, watched the new army march through the city gates, assessed the situation with the ancient pragmatism of someone who has things to sell and taxes to pay, and decided that this was, at least so far, going better than expected. Her name, for our purposes, is Shiren. She is going to be fine. The kings change. The dates keep selling. The market vendor's calculus has never changed across the long centuries of the ancient world. Assess the new administration, determine the new tax rate, adjust accordingly, and continue selling what you were already selling. This is not cynicism. This is the realism of someone who understands that survival is its own form of political participation, and that markets are a more reliable indicator of civilizational health than any amount of royal proclamation. Shiren's stall on the riverside is, in this sense, a more honest assessment of the Persian Empire's early years than anything Herodotus wrote. Let's be clear about something that tends to get lost in the dramatic narrative of conquest. After taking Babylon, after walking into the greatest city in the world and receiving the surrender of its institutions and its population without a major battle, Cyrus did something that no conqueror of the ancient world had done before, at least not on record, at least not with this clarity and this intention. He issued a statement of governing principles, a cylinder of fired clay, 23 centimeters long, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, laying out his policies for the empire he had just assembled. We call it the Cyrus Cylinder. It sits today in the British Museum in London, where it has been sitting since 1879, and it is one of the most discussed, most debated, and most politically claimed objects in the history of the ancient world. The cylinder says that Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, had chosen Cyrus as his instrument, had called him from a faraway kingdom to restore order to Babylon, which Nabonidus had mismanaged. It says that Cyrus entered Babylon in peace, that he did not oppress the population, that he removed the heavy yoke Nabonidus had placed on the people. It says that Cyrus restored the deported gods of various conquered peoples to their original sanctuaries. It says that he allowed the peoples who had been forcibly displaced, including, by strong implication, the Jewish community deported from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE, to return to their homelands. The modern debate about the Cyrus cylinder essentially runs: was this genuine humanitarian philosophy or sophisticated imperial propaganda? The answer historians have generally arrived at, with a kind of exhausted consensus, is it was both. And the fact that it was both is not the contradiction it might appear. Good ethics and good strategy pointed in the same direction, and Cyrus followed them both. The remarkable thing is not that he was merciful. The remarkable thing is that he had understood, with a clarity unusual for his era, that mercy was the most efficient tool of empire. The Jewish tradition was not confused about this. The Hebrew Bible describes Cyrus as a Messiah, literally an anointed one, the only non-Jewish figure to receive this designation in the Hebrew Scriptures. Isaiah calls him the shepherd of God, the man whose right hand God grasped, the one who would say to Jerusalem, "Be rebuilt," and to the temple, "Let your foundations be laid." This is extraordinary. This is a Persian king being celebrated as an instrument of divine will inside someone else's holy book, written by a people he had freed from generations of exile. They did not forget what he did. 40 generations later, they were still writing it down. The administrative structure Cyrus began, and Darius would perfect, was built on the same principle. The Persian Empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, from the Old Persian kshatrapavan, meaning protector of the kingdom, each governed by a satrap, a royal governor drawn from the Persian nobility, who managed taxation and military affairs while preserving local laws, religions, and customs. Over the satraps moved the royal inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, whose job was to audit the governors and report directly to the court, a check on the inevitable tendency of powerful regional administrators to forget who they worked for. The system was not perfect. No system is. But it was remarkable for its time. A framework explicitly designed to make diversity function rather than suppress it. A young scribe named Artabaza, a second-generation administrative worker, the son of a temple record keeper, recently posted to the building operations in the Persians' new ceremonial capital, was among those beginning to understand from the inside how this machine worked. He kept records of worker rations. He tracked material deliveries. He translated instructions from the architects into numbers on clay. He had ink-stained fingers and a persistent ache in the lower back from hours of bending over his writing surface. And he thought, sometimes, that a proper chair would be a significant improvement over the crouched scribe's posture that seemed to be accepted as a feature of the profession rather than a bug. He had begun work at the building site of Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital that Darius was constructing on a rocky platform south of the older city of Pasargadae. He was 23 years old. He did not know that the clay tablets he was filling, carefully and methodically, every day, with ration numbers and worker names and material quantities, would survive for 2,500 years and become among the most significant documents in the archaeological record of the ancient world. He was just doing his job, which is, as it turns out, often exactly how the most permanent things get made. Now, let's talk about Cambyses II, because you cannot get to Darius without going through Cambyses. And going through Cambyses is an experience that ancient historians found profoundly uncomfortable, and modern historians find fascinatingly instructive about the limits of ancient historical sources. Cyrus the Great died in battle in 530 BCE. The exact circumstances are genuinely disputed, which is somewhat undignified for a man who had conquered most of the known world. But the ancient world did not guarantee its most accomplished individuals a documented ending. His son, Cambyses II, had been co-ruler for a period and stepped into the kingship with the advantage of having been prepared for it. His first significant achievement as sole king was the conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE, which was a genuine military and logistical triumph. Egypt had never been conquered by an Eastern power before. Its defensive position was formidable, and the campaign required coordination of land and sea forces across several hundred miles. And then, according to nearly every ancient source that writes about him, Cambyses II proceeded to descend into a progressively spectacular series of erratic and impious behaviors. Herodotus, who is our primary source for Cambyses, and who is a magnificent storyteller with a complicated relationship with journalistic accuracy, describes him as having mocked Egyptian religious practice, desecrated temples, stabbed the sacred Apis bull, which was the physical embodiment of the god Ptah, and treated with extraordinary reverence by the Egyptians, murdered his brother Smerdis out of paranoid jealousy, killed his sister, wife, in a rage, and generally conducted himself in a manner that suggested the exercise of absolute power had done something to his judgment that no amount of good upbringing could repair. Herodotus suggests he was mad. He also suggests, in the same passage, that Persians believed madness was a punishment for impiety, which tells you something about the interpretive framework Herodotus was working within. Modern historians have been systematically dismantling this picture for about a century, and they have made significant progress. The Egyptian priestly records, the primary source for the temple desecration stories, were written by people with every institutional reason to portray a foreign conqueror as a villain. The archaeological evidence from Egypt shows Persian-era dedications in Egyptian temples that look considerably more respectful than Herodotus suggests. The Apis bull, killed by Cambyses, may have been a different animal, dying of natural causes, that was retconned into a stabbing. The murder of Smerdis is disputed. Some sources say Smerdis was killed. Some say he wasn't. And the whole narrative of the succession crisis that followed Cambyses' death reads like it was constructed after the fact to justify Darius's seizure of the throne. What is probably accurate is that Cambyses was a capable administrator who made real errors. His southbound military expedition toward Ethiopia and his attempt to send an army across the Libyan desert both ended in disaster. The desert army apparently disappearing entirely, which Herodotus attributes to a sandstorm, and modern archaeologists have occasionally tried to find archaeological evidence of, and that his personality was significantly less conciliatory than his father's, generating friction with people he needed to impress. He was also, by various accounts, a heavy drinker, which, in a court culture organized around elaborate drinking ceremonies and well stocked with wine, was perhaps an occupational hazard rather than a personal failing. He died in 522 BCE, returning from Egypt to deal with a rebellion that had broken out during his absence. A man claiming to be his murdered brother, Smerdis, had appeared and seized the throne. The circumstances of Cambyses' death are disputed. The identity of the false Smerdis is disputed. Almost everything about this transition period is disputed, which is the ancient world's way of telling you that the winner wrote the history and the loser's version didn't survive. What emerged from the confusion was Darius, son of Hystaspes, a relatively distant member of the Achaemenid family who had served as a royal spear-bearer and who appeared at the right moment with a coalition of 6 Persian noble families, killed the man on the throne and announced himself king. The speed and thoroughness with which Darius then moved to consolidate power suggests, with considerable hindsight, that he had been waiting for exactly this kind of chaos, not creating it necessarily, but ready for it, prepared to move through it faster than anyone else could respond. That is the kind of preparation that can look, from the outside, like destiny, and which is, from the inside, the patient work of a man who has been paying attention. The great empire that Cyrus had built had its second architect, Darius the First, the man who would turn a collection of conquered territories into a functioning civilization. Let's start with the quality that made Darius extraordinary, which was not military genius, though he had that, and not charisma, though he had that too, but an organizational intelligence so thorough and so systematic that it reads, from 2,500 years away, as something almost modern in its ambition. Darius the First became king of the Persian Empire in 522 BCE. His first decade was occupied almost entirely with suppression of revolts, which were extensive because a change of power under circumstances as murky as Darius's reliably produces every ambitious person in the vicinity deciding to test the situation simultaneously. The revolts came from Babylonia, from Elam, from Media, from Parthia, from Margiana, from Satagidia, from Egypt. 19 rebel leaders by Darius's own count. Spoiler: they all lost. He suppressed them in sequence with extraordinary speed, moving from one theater to another with a logistical efficiency that suggested not just military talent, but a mind that could hold multiple simultaneous operations in coherent relationship. When he was finished, he had the whole thing recorded. 3 languages carved into a cliff face at Bisitun, high in the Zagros mountains, showing himself with his foot on the chest of the defeated false Smerdis, and the 19 rebel kings led before him in a chain, with a winged figure of Ahura Mazda presiding over the whole scene. The inscription is 15 meters high and in a location visible from the main road through the pass, which was the primary route between the Persian heartland and Mesopotamia. Darius did not do things by halves, and he did not miss an opportunity to communicate. By around 513 BCE, the empire was stable, and his energy turned to what would define his reign: building systems. He standardized the currency. The gold Daric coin, bearing the image of the king in an archer's stance, became the dominant currency of the ancient Near East. Merchants from Egypt to India accepted it, which meant that the Persian Empire was, in its monetary policy, performing something functionally equivalent to what the dollar does in modern international trade. Stable, trusted, universally recognized. The world runs on the king's face. He regularized the satrapy tax system. Herodotus recorded the tribute assessments for each province, which is one of the most useful single pages in his entire history. You can see in the numbers the relative productivity and wealth of every region of the empire. Babylonia and Egypt paid the most because they were the most agriculturally productive. The nomadic Ethiopians and the mountain Persians paid in kind, in timber, horses, livestock, because they didn't have the agricultural surplus that made monetary tribute practical. The system was calibrated to what each region could actually provide, which is a more sophisticated tax policy than many modern states manage. He built, or rather, he completed and extended the Royal Road. The Royal Road ran from Susa, the administrative capital, to Sardis on the Aegean coast, 2,700 kilometers, 111 relay stations, each station positioned about a day's hard ride from the last, each stocked with fresh horses and provisions for couriers. The fastest couriers, royal messengers riding in relay, swapping horses at each station without stopping, could cover the entire route in approximately 7 days. 7 days from the western edge of modern Iran to the western coast of Turkey. Herodotus observed this with evident admiration and recorded the description of the Persian courier service that was later paraphrased and carved onto the facade of the General Post Office in New York City in 1914. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, which most Americans assume is a description of their own postal service, and which is, in fact, a 2,500-year-old tribute to Persian infrastructure engineering. And at the end of this decade of systematic construction and consolidation on a high limestone platform in Parsa, south of the older Achaemenid capital at Pasargadae, positioned to catch both the mountain breezes and the views. Workers were leveling the rock and beginning to lay the foundations of what Darius had decided would be the empire's ceremonial heart, Persepolis. At the fire altar above the construction site, a small stone platform where the sacred flame had been burning since the priests arrived to consecrate the ground. The fire continued as always, tended each morning before the workers came, as it had been tended in every Persian sacred space since the days before empire. Artabaza, who was managing the ration accounts at the construction site, could see it from his writing room. A small, steady point of orange light in the early blue of a Persian mountain morning, unchanged by the ambition and the noise and the scaffolding all around it. It was, possibly, the most permanent thing on the site. Everything else was still being built. Let's be clear about what Persepolis was, because it is one of the most misunderstood places in the ancient world, and the misunderstanding is partly the fault of Alexander, who destroyed it, and partly the fault of the Greeks, who described it primarily in terms of its wealth, and partly the fault of later romanticizers, who wanted it to be a palace complex when it was something considerably stranger and more interesting. Persepolis was not the administrative capital of the Persian Empire. That was Susa, the city on the Shur River in southwestern Persia, connected to the royal road, surrounded by productive agricultural land, positioned at the center of the empire's communications network, where the king actually sat for most of the year, and where the actual business of running 23 nations was conducted in the treasury offices and throne halls and archive rooms that hummed with scribes and messengers and satraps coming to report. Susa is where you ran the empire. Persepolis is where you showed what the empire was. It was a ceremonial capital. Its primary purpose was the celebration of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, held at the spring equinox, which Zoroastrian tradition understood as the moment of creation's renewal, the annual recommitment of the world to truth and order. Every year, delegations arrived from every province of the empire, from Egypt and Libya, from Lydia and Ionia, from Babylon and Elam, from India and Ethiopia, from Sogdiana and Bactria in Central Asia, from the Scythian steppes to the north. And they came to Persepolis to present tribute, to be seen, and to participate in the great act of imperial self-recognition that Nowruz represented. You would have approached across the plain on foot or horseback or in a delegation's formal procession. The rock platform rises about 15 meters from the surrounding ground. A man-made mountain of limestone, faced and dressed, approached by a broad ceremonial double staircase, whose steps are shallow enough that a rider could walk a horse up them without dismounting. The visual effect is deliberate. You are ascending into something. You are moving from the ordinary world into the ordered world, from the human scale into something that announces, with stone and mathematics, that a different order of existence is in operation here. At the top, the gate of all nations, completed under Xerxes, through which every delegation passed on its way to the throne room. Massive stone bulls guard the entrance, apotropaic figures borrowed from Mesopotamian tradition, embedded in the Persian imperial vocabulary. You pass through. You are now inside the empire's image of itself. The Apadana, the main audience hall of Darius and Xerxes, is a forest of 72 columns, each 20 meters tall, capped with the famous double-headed bull capitals, whose two faces look outward in opposite directions, bearing the enormous weight of the cedar roof between them. The hall could accommodate an audience of 10,000 people. The cedar for that roof had come from Lebanon, transported overland and over water, because the plateau of Iran did not have cedar, and the king of Persia needed to demonstrate that distances were not an obstacle. but it is the carved reliefs that matter most. Every staircase, every wall, every retaining facade is covered in them. The procession of tribute bearers, each delegation in its own clothing, carrying its own specific gifts, leading its own particular animals. There are Ethiopians with a long-necked animal that scholars have identified as an okapi, the first artistic representation of an okapi in the historical record, carved at Persepolis 2,500 years ago by a craftsman who presumably had never seen one and was working from descriptions. There are Lydians with cups and horses. There are Babylonians with textiles and a bowl. There are Indians with baskets and a donkey. There are Bactrians with a camel, rendered with such specific anatomical accuracy that you can identify it as a Bactrian camel, and with an expression that has read across 2.5 millennia of audiences as one of resigned skepticism about the entire enterprise. The camel has been looking at Persepolis like this since roughly 500 BCE. It is the most consistent reaction in the historical record. The reliefs are precise enough that archaeologists can identify ethnic groups by their clothing, their hairstyles, their weapons. These are not generic representations of subject peoples. They are specific portraits of specific cultures, rendered with the care that an empire takes when it wants to show that it knows who it governs and respects the specificity of what it governs. You are in the picture. You are seen. That is the message. Artabaza walked through the completed Apadana on a rest day, years after he had been recording the ration deliveries for its construction. He ran his fingers along the carved relief of the Babylonian delegation, following the lines of a garment that was depicted in such precise detail that you could see the weave. One of the carved figures was holding a vase of a shape that was, if you knew what you were looking at, identical to the standardized measuring vessels used to distribute wine rations at the construction site. The same vessel he had been logging quantities of for 3 years. He did not say this out loud. It seemed too small a thought for the room. Still, he thought it. The women who had woven the textiles shown in the reliefs, the men who had cut the stone, the mule drivers who had hauled the Lebanese cedar up through the mountain passes to this plateau. none of them would see the finished building in the way Artabaza was seeing it now, running his fingers along the carved robes of the Babylonian delegation. The workers who built it had been the most proximate to the creation and the most removed from the ceremonial experience the creation was designed to produce. That is the nature of building things. The people who make them are never quite the intended audience, and yet they had made it. Whatever it meant to the kings and the satraps and the tributary delegations who came to Novruz, it also meant something to the craftsmen who had cut that particular fold in that particular robe on that particular day in 490 BCE, and whose name we don't know, but whose work has been standing in the sun and the rain of the Iranian plateau for 2,500 years. Now, let's talk about what it was actually like to live inside the Persian Empire. Not at court, not at the festival, not at the moment of conquest, but on an ordinary Tuesday when history was not happening and you were just trying to get through the day. The empire, at its greatest extent, stretched from Egypt and Libya in the west across Anatolia, and the Levant through Mesopotamia, through the Iranian plateau, through Central Asia, to the edges of India. It contained, by modern estimates, somewhere between 40 and 50 million people, roughly half the human population of the entire planet at that moment in history, which means that the Persian Empire was not, from the perspective of the people living in it, one empire among several. It was the world. Everything else was the edge. So what were those 40-odd million people doing? In Babylon, which had retained its position as a major commercial hub under Persian administration, its markets and temples and scribal schools functioning largely as they had before, Shirin the date vendor was doing what she had always done, setting up her basket in the morning, calling out her prices, arguing good-naturedly with customers about the quality of the current season's harvest, paying her taxes in the standardized silver that Darius's monetary reform had introduced, and finding the new silver slightly more convenient than the complicated bartering arrangements of earlier administrations. She had expanded her operation in the years since Cyrus's arrival. She now had a regular stall rather than a walking basket, and a nephew who helped with the heavy lifting in exchange for a cut of the profits and 2 meals a day. The Persian administration had not changed her life in any way that felt like conquest. It had changed the paperwork slightly, and the tax collector's name significantly. And otherwise, life went on. In the mountains of Lydia, a Greek merchant named Menesarchus, of medium prosperity, with a warehouse in Sardis and a small partnership in a coastal trading enterprise operating out of Ephesus, was doing what Greek merchants had always done, moving goods around the Aegean basin, buying cheap and selling dear, navigating the endlessly complex network of relationships and obligations that held ancient Mediterranean commerce together. The Persian administration of Lydia had, from his perspective, introduced some improvements. The standardized coinage made transactions with distant counterparts simpler, and the security of the road network in the interior had reduced the bandit tax on overland shipments, and some irritants, primarily the paperwork requirements associated with cross-provincial trade, and the fact that the tariff payments now went to a satrap's treasury rather than the Lydian king's. He wrote letters to his trading partners complaining about the administrative requirements. The letters have not survived, but their energy has. It surfaces, diffused and amplified in the broader Greek literary tradition's portrayal of Persian administration as intrusive and officious, which is what annoyance about trade paperwork looks like when it gets enough generations to develop into cultural memory. In the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, in a small farming community that had been in his family for 4 generations, a man named Bagabigna, a Persian infantry soldier currently between campaigns on the land that his great-grandfather had received as a military service grant in the early days of the empire, was doing the morning maintenance that his courtyard required. He checked the grain storage. He repaired a section of fence that the goats had compromised. And then, before the work of the day properly began, he tended the fire in the small stone altar in the corner of his courtyard, adding fuel carefully, ensuring the flame was clean and steady, performing the brief Zoroastrian prayers that his father had taught him and his father's father had taught his father. He had served in 3 campaigns. He had not particularly distinguished himself in any of them, which was exactly what he had aimed for. The purpose of not distinguishing yourself in ancient warfare being to come home, which is its own kind of triumph. He had a wife and 2 children, and a house with a good roof. He had his land, and his fire, and his prayers. The empire was the sky, He noticed it when it rained, meaning when the tax collector came or the levy was called, and otherwise got on with his life underneath it. This is how most people inside the Persian Empire experienced it, not as a grand historical drama, not as the meeting of civilizations, not as the subject of epic poetry, but as a set of administrative facts overlaid on the life they had always been living. The king's name changed. The coin changed. The language of the official documents changed. The dates were still good. The fire still burned. The goats still compromised the fence. The food was particular to where you were. In Babylon, the diet ran heavy on fish from the river, and dates, and barley, bread, and vegetables grown in the canal-fed gardens. A cuisine that smelled, in the market hours, of river mud, and frying oil, and dried fruit, and the particular fermented sharpness of date wine, which the Babylonians produced in quantities that suggested either great enthusiasm or great necessity. In the Persian heartland, the diet was meat heavier. The foothills and plains supported cattle and sheep, and the Persian tradition of conspicuous hospitality meant that any gathering of consequence involved substantial food, a tradition the Greek historian Herodotus observed and found impressive and slightly alarming. In Egypt, under Persian administration, the diet was what it had always been: bread and beer and fish from the Nile, and onions in quantities that the administrative records suggest were considered a basic food group. The Persian administrative system did not attempt to standardize what people ate. It standardized what they paid in taxes. What you ate was your own affair. The textile industries were enormous and diverse. The Persepolis tablets record extensive textile production by female workers, wool processing, weaving, sewing, and the finished textiles moving through the distribution system as payment for specialized services and as luxury exports. The cloth produced in different regions had different characteristics that the administrative records tracked with the same precision they applied to grain. Persian wool, Babylonian cotton cloth, Egyptian linen, the silk that was beginning to arrive from further east along the trade routes through Central Asia, still exotic and still expensive, and still described in records with a kind of careful precision that suggests the scribe was writing about something whose value they fully understood. The clothing that the tribute bearers wore in the carved reliefs at Persepolis was not artistic license. It was documentary. The Lydians wore their particular cut. The Bactrians wore theirs. The empire was, among other things, a fashion show in stone, and the stone had excellent memory. The language situation was more complicated than almost any modern state manages. The official language of imperial administration was Aramaic, already a widely spoken trade language across the Near East, adopted as the lingua franca of the empire because it was already there and it worked. But the spoken languages of the empire's 23 peoples were left entirely alone. You could walk from Sardis to Susa speaking different languages in every city. And the imperial administration would communicate with you in Aramaic at the official level and expect you to manage the rest yourself. The scribes who handled the translation work, and there were many of them, multilingual specialists who are almost entirely invisible in the historical record, except in the lists of their rations and the records of their professional designations, were among the most essential workers in the empire, the connective tissue between the king's Aramaic proclamations and the realities of a world that spoke Elamite and Babylonian and Greek and Old Persian and Egyptian, Demotic, and half a dozen other languages simultaneously. The fire at Bagabigna's altar had been burning. In this same spot, in this same courtyard, since before he was born. His father had tended it, and his father's father before him, and back through the generations to a time before the empire, before Cyrus, before any king had united these mountain people into a civilization that would, briefly, contain half the world. The fire did not know about empires. The fire just burned. This is where it gets complicated in a way that even the people living through it didn't fully understand. Let's not forget that the Greeks existed. In 490 BCE, a Persian expeditionary force under the command of the generals Datis and Artaphernes, dispatched by Darius to deal with some unruly Greek city-states that had supported a rebellion in Ionia, the Greek-populated coastal cities of western Anatolia, landed at Marathon on the coast of Attica, about 40 kilometers northeast of Athens, and was defeated by the Athenian army in a battle that the Greeks would spend the next several centuries describing with a fervor usually reserved for events that saved civilization itself. The Battle of Marathon was a genuine Persian defeat. The Athenian army, probably outnumbered, but fighting on terrain that neutralized some of the Persian cavalry advantage, used a formation attack that struck the Persian flanks while thinning the center. And it worked. The Persian force retreated to its ships and sailed away. The Athenian army then conducted what may be the most famous march in the history of athletics, though the specific story of the runner dying on arrival to announce the victory is a later elaboration on the event, not contemporary documentation. And Athens celebrated its victory with an intensity of relief and pride that tells you exactly how terrified they had been. Here is what Marathon was not. It was not the decisive engagement that halted a Persian conquest of Greece. It was a punitive expedition by Persian imperial standards, a response to specific acts of interference in Persian provincial affairs, not a full commitment to Western expansion. The empire had not mobilized anything close to its full military capacity. Marathon was, from the Persian court's perspective, an annoying setback in a secondary theater of operations, filed in the administrative records somewhere between complications in the western provinces and will require follow-up. From the Athenian perspective, Marathon was the moment that proved Athens could resist the greatest power in the world. These are the same event. They just mean entirely different things. Darius died in 486 BCE, in the midst of planning a larger expedition that he did not live to launch, the kind of death that history provides to powerful men who have more planned than they have time for, which suggests that the universe has a certain conservatism about concentrated ambition. His son Xerxes took the throne and inherited both the empire and his father's unfinished business in the West. The real invasion of Greece was coming, and when it came, it would be nothing like Marathon. There is one more thing about Marathon worth staying with before we move forward, a thing that the Greek narrative of heroism tends to crowd out, which is the perspective of the people who lost. The Persian soldiers at Marathon were not, from the inside of their own lives, the villains of a civilization-defending drama. They were conscripted men from the provinces, soldiers who served because the empire required it, who had crossed the Aegean to deal with what their king had described as a punitive expedition against specific troublemakers, and who had run directly into a tactical situation that nobody in their command had quite anticipated. They retreated to their ships. They went home. For most of them, Marathon was simply a bad day in a military career, not the pivot point of history. History happened to them from the outside, the way it usually does to the people most directly affected by it. The Greek narrative of Marathon, the story of democracy triumphant, of free citizens defeating empire, of the small standing against the overwhelming, is a powerful and genuinely moving story. It is also a story told by the winners, from the winner's perspective, across the winner's centuries of subsequent cultural production. The Persian perspective on Marathon exists primarily in the administrative records. The expedition was noted, analyzed, and the planning for a larger response began. That is all we have from the losing side. That silence is part of the story too. What comes next needs to be told differently. This is not because the events that follow are incomprehensible or without the full complexity of human motivation and human cost. They have plenty of both. But the scale is large enough, and the suffering genuine enough, and the consequences serious enough, that the lighter register that has served us through the building, and the administrative ingenuity, and the paradise gardens isn't quite right for what happened in 480 BCE. So we'll hold the humor for later, and take this one at the pace it deserves. Xerxes I became king of the Persian Empire in 486 BCE. He was the son of Darius and Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great, which made him, by blood, the inheritor of both the empire's political and dynastic tradition. He was tall, by all accounts. He was, in the physical language of ancient portraiture, imposing. He was genuinely devoted to Zoroastrian practice. He completed significant portions of Persepolis. The gate of all nations bears his inscription. The throne hall, or hall of 100 columns, was begun under him. And he governed the interior of his empire with the administrative competence his dynasty had built up over generations. He also invaded Greece. The invasion of 480 BCE was, in terms of logistical scale, unlike anything the ancient world had attempted before. The ancient sources claim numbers that modern historians reject as impossible. 2.5 million soldiers is Herodotus's figure, which would have been operationally insane given the food supply requirements. But even the revised modern estimates run between 100,000 and 300,000 troops, supported by a fleet of perhaps 600 to 1,200 ships. To move this force across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe, Xerxes had 2 bridges of boats built, lashed together, planked over, equipped with earthworks on the sides to prevent the horses from seeing the water when the first bridges were destroyed by a storm. He reportedly had the Hellespont itself whipped for its insolence, which is either a remarkable piece of theater or the first recorded instance of a powerful man having an argument with the weather and losing. He reportedly had the Hellespont whipped for its insolence, because a king of kings does not allow geography to have opinions. Spoiler: the sea was not chastened. He also had a canal cut through the Mount Athos Peninsula to avoid the dangerous cape that had destroyed his predecessor's fleet. This canal, 2 kilometers long, hand-dug by an enormous labor force, is still partially visible in satellite imagery today. The engineering commitment to this invasion was extraordinary. The army crossed into Europe. It marched through Thrace, received the submission of Macedonia, and descended on Greece. The Greek city-states assembled a coalition, contentious, never quite unified, organized by Sparta and Athens, with the kind of mutual suspicion that free peoples tend to bring to cooperation, and prepared to resist. At the pass of Thermopylae, a narrow coastal defile in central Greece, where the road from northern Greece ran between the mountains and the sea, a combined Greek force, including 300 Spartans under their king Leonidas, 400 Thebans, 700 Thespians, and various other contingents, took up position. They held the pass for 3 days, the confined space negating the Persian numerical advantage, and the Greek heavy infantry performing with extraordinary discipline against repeated assault. On the 3rd day, a local man named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that went around the Greek position. The flanking force arrived. Leonidas released most of the allied contingents. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and some of the Thebans stayed. They died there. There is genuine heroism in this, and it would be a disservice to the people who died at Thermopylae to diminish it in the name of Persian perspective. The Spartan soldiers who chose to stand and die when they knew the position was lost were doing something that transcends the political calculation of any empire. Their courage is real, and was real, and deserves to be held as such, without needing a geopolitical frame around it. The Persian army continued south. Athens was evacuated. The Athenian assembly, in a decision of extraordinary courage and cold calculation, voted to abandon the city itself and concentrate their population on ships and on the island of Salamis. The Athenians remembered that the oracle had said their salvation lay in wooden walls, and they had decided, against every instinct of place and home and heritage, that the wooden walls were ships. They were right. The Persian army entered the empty city. They burned the Acropolis and the temples on it. This was, in the logic of ancient warfare, a legitimate act of retaliation. The Greeks had previously burned the Persian provincial capital of Sardis. Retaliation was not merely permitted under the rules of ancient warfare. It was essentially required by the honor system that governed state behavior. This context was not included in subsequent Greek accounts of the burning, for reasons that require no particular explanation. The Battle of Salamis, fought in the narrow straits between the island and the Attic coast, was a Persian naval defeat. The Greek fleet was smaller, but more maneuverable, and it was fighting in a confined space that the larger Persian fleet could not effectively deploy in. The Greeks had arranged the battle to take place there specifically because of this. Xerxes watched from a throne set on the hillside above the straits. He had expected to watch a Persian victory, and he watched instead as his fleet broke and retreated, the formation collapsing in the narrow water, ships ramming each other in the confusion, the afternoon turning badly. He sat there. He watched it end. And somewhere among the tens of thousands of Persian soldiers and sailors in that campaign, Egyptians conscripted from the Nile Delta, Babylonians from the great river cities, Ionians from the coast they were now fighting against, Persians from the mountain villages, men who had left their courtyards and their fire altars and their families and their ordinary lives to cross into Europe on a king's order and face armies fighting for their homes. Among all these men, the cost of the day at Salamis fell. They did not choose this war. They were the empire made flesh, marching where the empire marched, dying where the empire fought, their names unrecorded, except as numbers in a casualty figure that the history books would later dispute. Xerxes pulled the main force back to Asia. He left a substantial army in Greece under the general Mardonius, which was defeated at Plataea the following year. The Greek campaign was over. The empire was intact. Greece was not worth the cost of another attempt, and both sides understood this well enough that they eventually arrived at the Peace of Callias around 449 BCE, which formally ended the conflict and implicitly acknowledged that the Persian Empire would not try to conquer mainland Greece, and Greece would not interfere in Persian affairs. A reasonable outcome, 50 years too late. Xerxes returned to Persepolis. He continued to build. He governed his empire, the enormous, diverse, still functioning empire that had survived this very expensive detour into the Western theater for another 15 years. He was assassinated in 465 BCE in his bedroom at night by a courtier named Artabanus in conspiracy with Xerxes' son. He was killed in the palace he had built, in the city he had completed, surrounded by the carved stone record of all the nations that had come to honor the empire he inherited. The fire at the Persepolis altar burned through the night of his death, tended by the night priest who did not yet know. The flame did not know about the death. The flame just burned. Now, let's talk about what it looks like when a great empire starts to tire, because this is a different kind of history from the building years, a slower and, in some ways, more human history, the history of an institution encountering the limits of what institutions can sustain over time. After Xerxes, the kings were Artaxerxes I, who reigned from 465 to 424 BCE, and is, relatively speaking, a figure of stability. His 40-year reign produced no catastrophic policy failures and several genuine successes, including the final resolution of the Greek conflict. Then Xerxes II, who lasted 45 days before being murdered by his half-brother. Then Sogdianus, who lasted 6 months before being deposed and killed by another half-brother. Then Darius II, who lasted 19 years. Then Artaxerxes II, who lasted 45 years, which in this period of Persian history represents either genuine competence, extraordinary luck, or some combination of institutional inertia and managed decline that is difficult to distinguish from either. This is not, to be clear, the story of an empire falling apart. The Persian Empire under Artaxerxes II and Artaxerxes III was still the dominant power in the ancient world, the richest, the most territorially extensive, the most administratively sophisticated. The tribute still arrived. The road network still functioned. The satrapies still operated. The Persian fleet, rebuilt after Salamis, was strong enough that it was actively financing and supporting various Greek city-states against each other in the Peloponnesian War, a policy of exquisite imperial cynicism that kept the Greeks too busy fighting among themselves to cause trouble on the Persian border. But the court had become a different kind of place. The mechanisms of the early empire, the close personal relationship between the king and his noble families, the military culture of active campaigns, the administrative energy of Darius's reform decades, had given way to something more formal, more distant, more mediated. Kings who had never personally led armies sat on thrones surrounded by advisors whose primary skill was not military or administrative competence, but proximity to power and the art of remaining useful without becoming threatening. Palace intrigue, which had always existed in Persian courts. The successions of Xerxes and his sons were complicated enough, became increasingly the mechanism of political change. Assassinations, coups, disputed successions. Artaxerxes II spent significant portions of his reign dealing with satrapal rebellions, governors who had accumulated enough autonomous power to consider themselves independent actors. The eyes and ears of the king were still operating, but the further from Susa the satrap's territory, and the longer the satrap had been in place, the more the reporting tended to resemble what the king wanted to hear rather than what was actually happening. This is not a Persian problem. This is a universal problem of large institutions operating over long time periods. Every organization that has ever existed has experienced the drift from founding energy to institutional momentum to institutional inertia, and the Persian Empire was no different. What made it remarkable was how long it took to arrive at this point, and how capable the system remained even as the founding energies faded. The ordinary people, Artabaza, the scribe's grandchildren, who had never been to Persepolis and had never heard of the ration records their grandfather kept. Shirin's granddaughter in Babylon, who ran a spice stall now. Bagabigna's great-grandchildren in their mountain village, tending the same courtyard fire their ancestor had tended in the days of Darius, continued their lives largely unchanged. The taxes came. The occasional levy came. Administrators came and went. The empire was the sky. You noticed it when it rained. The one place where the change was felt most sharply was in the military. The Persian Empire's armies had, in the early centuries, been organized around the personal military culture of the Persian aristocracy. The riding and the archery and the speaking truth code that produced men who were both competent soldiers and, in some genuine sense, invested in what they were fighting for. By the 4th century BCE, the heavy infantry corps of the army was increasingly Greek mercenaries, professional soldiers from the city-states of Greece who were between wars at home and found Persian employment both well-paid and relatively honorable. The 10,000, the famous Greek mercenary force that marched deep into Persian territory in 401 BCE to support a claimant to the throne, found themselves stranded when their employer was killed, and then marched out again through hostile territory to the Black Sea coast. An epic retreat that Xenophon recorded in his Anabasis. These were the visible face of a broader reality. The Persian military was outsourcing its center of gravity. The cavalry remained Persian. The cavalry remained excellent, but the battle-deciding heavy infantry were increasingly Hellenic. This was not a sign of weakness so much as a sign of pragmatism. The Persians had always been pragmatic about incorporating useful elements from the peoples they governed, but it was also a sign of drift. The gap between the founding vision and the operational reality growing wider with each generation that had not personally known war as Cyrus had known it. And somewhere on the western edge of the Greek world, in a cold northern kingdom called Macedonia, a young prince named Alexander was reading Aristotle and studying the Persian Empire's military organization and learning in the careful private curriculum of a brilliant student. everything that he would eventually use against it. Let's start with Datia. She appears in a collection of roughly 30,000 clay tablets and fragments excavated from the northeastern corner of the Persepolis platform. Tablets written in the Elamite language, in cuneiform script, covering the years 509 to 493 BCE. They are, at their most literal, accounting records. Who received what? How much? When? From which distribution point? They track rations of wine, beer, barley, and meat distributed to workers at Persepolis and in the surrounding region. They are also, in a way that nobody who made them intended, the most detailed portrait we have of ordinary life inside the Persian Empire. A portrait that corrects, in its dry, numerical way, almost every assumption that the Greek literary tradition made about Persian civilization. Datia is listed as a female worker receiving rations at Persepolis. Her allocation level indicates a skilled classification. She is receiving more than basic subsistence, which means she was doing something that required training and was compensated accordingly. She received her ration regularly, in the quantities her classification specified. And then there is a period in the tablets where her ration is supplemented, and the notation indicates a recently delivered child. The extra ration for new mothers was standard policy. The tablets show it repeatedly. Someone in the Persian administration had decided that women who had recently given birth needed more food, had written this into the ration distribution rules, and the administrators in the field had followed the rule and recorded the distributions. The tablets do not call attention to this. They do not celebrate it. They just record it, the way you record any standard operating procedure, as a thing that happens because the system says it happens. The Persepolis fortification tablets, taken as a whole, reveal a labor force of extraordinary diversity and complexity. Workers from Persia, Media, Babylon, Egypt, Lydia, Cappadocia, Ionia, Bactria, India, people from every corner of the empire working on the same construction project, receiving standardized rations adjusted for skill level and family circumstance. Women appear throughout, in various roles and at various levels of seniority. There is a woman in the tablets who is listed as the overseer of a group of female workers, a management position with authority over others, with compensation that reflects that authority. The tablets record her decisions. They do not apologize for them or explain them. She has authority. She exercises it. The records note it. There is a male worker who disappears from the regular distribution records for a period and then reappears. His rations going to a colleague while he was absent, returning to him when he came back. The most natural reading is illness, recovery, colleagues who picked up his ration share because the system allowed for it. A small act of institutional care, recorded in clay, 2,500 years old. There is a worker. The records suggest a skilled craftsman, possibly in stone cutting, who received double rations for a period that corresponds, based on the dates, with a major construction phase on the Apadana. He was being paid more because he was working more, or because his skills were in high demand, and the administration knew it. These are not the stories that the history of ancient empires usually tells. The standard ancient empire narrative has kings and battles and the rise and fall of dynasties. The Persepolis tablets have Datia and her extra ration, and the colleague who was sick, and the woman who supervised the other women. They have the texture of a working life, the daily reality of being a person inside the largest administrative structure the world had yet built. And what they show is that the people inside that structure were overwhelmingly treated as people, fed, housed, compensated, cared for when circumstances required care. This does not make the Persian Empire a utopia. It was not. There were slaves in the empire, particularly in the old Babylonian tradition. The conquered peoples did not choose their incorporation. The tribute was not optional, and the consequences of non-payment were real. The empire was an empire, and it had all the things that empires have: hierarchy, coercion, the background understanding that the king's army existed and could be directed at you if you became sufficiently inconvenient. But the Persepolis tablets tell us something that 25 centuries of Greek-mediated historical interpretation had obscured: that the people who built this empire's greatest monument were recognized as human beings within the empire's own administrative framework. That Datia received her extra ration. That the sick worker came back. that the woman with authority over other women exercised that authority, and it was recorded as a simple fact of organizational life. That is worth knowing. That is the kind of truth that the fire at the altar knew, even if the history books did not. Let's talk about Darius III, because he is among the most unfairly remembered men in the ancient world, a man whose name has become, in the popular imagination, a synonym for the kind of failure that history loves to attach to the last person standing before everything changes. He did not plan to be king. He was Kotomanus before he became Darius III, a provincial official, a governor of a minor territory, a man of evident competence who had served the empire in various capacities without any particular expectation of reaching the throne. The previous two kings, Artaxerxes III and Artaxerxes IV, had both been assassinated in rapid succession by the court vizier Bagoas, who was attempting to install a controllable puppet on the throne of the world's most powerful empire, which is the kind of plan that requires everything to go right and finds that nothing does. When Bagoas installed Kotomanus as Darius III, he found that his new puppet had a will of his own. Darius III reportedly forced Bagoas to drink the poison Bagoas had been keeping for him. The puppet had pulled its own strings and found it surprisingly satisfying. He inherited an empire that was not collapsing. It is important to say this clearly, because the narrative of Persia's fall to Alexander tends to imply a terminal decline that the evidence does not fully support. The Persian Empire of 336 BCE was still the largest political entity in the ancient world, still commanding enormous resources, still operating its administrative systems. Its problems were real. The satrapy system had become more autonomous than Darius I had designed it to be. The military had become dependent on Greek mercenary infantry to supplement its cavalry strengths. The court had been destabilized by Bagoas's repeated assassinations. But the empire was not a hollow shell. It was a functioning state, experiencing institutional stress. What it was not designed to handle was Alexander of Macedon. Alexander crossed into Persian territory in 334 BCE with an army of roughly 35,000 men, small by Persian standards, outrageously ambitious by Macedonian standards. and organized around a tactical innovation called the Sarissa phalanx that combined the armored discipline of Greek heavy infantry with a cavalry coordination that no army had previously achieved. The satraps of the western provinces met him at the Granicus River in modern northwestern Turkey and underestimated him. They died. Spoiler, they always died. Darius III met him in force at Issus in 333 BCE on a narrow coastal plain in southern Turkey, where the terrain constrained both armies and the Persian numerical advantage was reduced to something more manageable. The battle, by all accounts, was close until Alexander personally led a cavalry charge that broke the Persian left flank and drove directly toward Darius himself. The Persian line broke. Darius fled, left the battlefield in a chariot and then on horseback, abandoning his camp and, in the camp, his family. His mother, Sisigambis, his wife, Statera, his daughters. Alexander treated them with the courtesy due to royalty. He told Sisigambis she was not a prisoner, but an honored guest. He gave them their household servants and their possessions and their dignity. By all accounts, Greek accounts, admittedly, but consistent ones, he meant it genuinely. Sisigambis, who had been prepared for the worst, reportedly became so fond of Alexander that she later mourned him as a son. Darius sent letters. He offered a ransom for his family. He offered a boundary agreement. Everything west of the Euphrates would be Alexander's. The east would remain Persian. He offered his daughter in marriage and an alliance. Parmenion, Alexander's senior general, reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept these terms. Alexander reportedly said that if he were Parmenion, he would too. Alexander was not Parmenion. The final confrontation came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE on a wide flat plain in modern northern Iraq that Darius had chosen specifically because it gave his cavalry room to maneuver and allowed him to deploy his scythed chariots. He had the ground leveled. He had assembled an army drawn from every remaining province of the empire. He had done everything that could be done. He had studied the previous battles. He had prepared for what Alexander had done before and tried to create conditions in which it would not work. He lost anyway. Alexander found the gap in the Persian line. There is always a gap, and Alexander always found it, drove his cavalry through it, and the Persian formation broke. Darius fled again. He fled east. He fled toward Bactria, toward the deep interior of the empire, where there were still loyal troops and loyal satraps, and the possibility of continuing resistance. He was traveling with a small force, moving fast, when the satrap Bessus, who had decided that a regime change of his own making was preferable to serving a king who kept losing battles to Macedonians, had him arrested. Bessus intended to offer Darius as a bargaining chip to Alexander, or to kill him and claim the kingship himself. When Alexander's advance cavalry came into view, Bessus had Darius stabbed and left him on the road. Alexander found him dying. He covered him with his own cloak. He arranged a royal funeral. He had Bessus captured, tried by Persian legal procedures for the crime of regicide, and executed by the method that Persian law specified for that offense, his nose and ears cut off, his body divided. Darius III had been, the evidence suggests, neither a coward nor a bad king. He had been a capable man, walking into an impossible situation, facing an opponent whose speed and tactical creativity had exceeded the capacity of any defensive system the Persian Empire knew how to build. He ran from Issus and from Gaugamela because the battles were lost, not because he had stopped fighting. He was still fighting when Bessus stopped him. He deserved better from history than to be remembered primarily as the man who fled. But history is written by the people with the better writers. And Alexander had among his entourage several of them. Let's set the scene one more time. The year is 330 BCE. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the city of 72 columns and carved tribute bearers, the platform where the eternal fire had burned through the decades of Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes, the place where 23 nations came to show the empire what it looked like, has fallen to Alexander of Macedon. The garrison did not fight. The treasury, which contained more gold and silver than most modern nations carry in reserve, the accumulated tribute of 2 centuries of the world's largest empire, has been catalogued and removed on 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels, according to Plutarch. which is either accurate hyperbole or regular hyperbole, but either way represents a quantity of wealth so large that it took months to transport, and that the Macedonian army simply did not have the pack animals for it first. And then Persepolis burned. The ancient sources disagree, as they disagree about almost everything interesting. Arrian says Alexander burned Persepolis as deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BCE. A retaliatory act, consciously chosen, symmetrical, and intentional. Diodorus says it was deliberate and quotes a speech by an Athenian woman named Thais, who reportedly proposed it as an act of poetic justice. Plutarch says Alexander was already riding away from the city when he looked back, saw the fire had caught, regretted it immediately, and gave orders to put it out that arrived too late. Quintus Curtius says it was a party that got out of hand. The truth is probably some combination of all of them. A decision made in a charged emotional moment, assisted by wine and the theater of the occasion, that was not fully reversed, because reversing it would have required a different kind of person than Alexander was. What we know, Persepolis burned, the palace of Xerxes, the colonnaded halls, the archive rooms, the cedar roof of the Apadana, which had been shipped from Lebanon to provide the shade of a forest that the Iranian plateau did not produce. That cedar caught and fell, and the carved stone bulls watched from their capitals as the roof came down around them, and the heat cracked the stones of the tribute reliefs, and the Bactrian camel, with its expression of resigned skepticism, was covered in ash. What we know, the archive burned. The administrative records, the literary texts, the commentaries on the Avesta, the accumulated documentation of 2 centuries of Persian civilization, gone. Which is why you know the Persian Empire primarily through Greek eyes, and why the Greek narrative has always been the one that felt like the real story, and why the Persian perspective on the Persian wars exists mainly in the dry numerical language of ration records and the silence of everything that didn't survive. The library burned at Persepolis, and the books did not grow back, and the man who burned them had been educated by Aristotle, had read every Greek text that existed, had admired Persian culture enough to adopt Persian dress and Persian court customs, and execute his own generals for being insufficiently respectful to Persian nobles. He burned the library anyway. He took the gold and burned the books. And this is perhaps the truest thing about him, that his greatness and his destruction were not opposites, but aspects of the same overwhelming force. The fire that night at Persepolis was not the small holy flame that the priests had tended every morning on the altar above the platform. It was something else entirely. The kind of fire that Zoroastrian cosmology associated with chaos, with the destroying spirit, with the end of right order, the kind of fire that doesn't preserve anything, the kind that takes. And yet, let's not forget what the fire did not take. The Persepolis fortification. Tablets survived. They had been sealed into a storage room in the northeastern corner of the fortification wall. A fortunate architectural accident, the kind that history occasionally provides to balance the archival disasters. They sat there for 23 centuries, ignored by every subsequent occupant of the ruined site, until they were excavated by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in 1933. Datiya's ration record survived. Artabaza's accounting tablets survived. The worker who got sick and recovered, and the double ration craftsman during the Apadana construction phase, they survived in the clay. The destruction did not reach them. Zoroastrianism survived. Not the texts that burned at Persepolis. Most of the Avesta, the Zoroastrian scripture, had to be reconstructed in later centuries from oral tradition and surviving fragments. A project of remarkable cultural determination, but the faith itself, the sacred fires, were not extinguished. The tradition holds that certain fire altars were carried out of Persepolis before the destruction, taken east and north into the mountains and the less accessible regions of the Iranian plateau, kept alive by priests who understood that the symbol mattered more than the building. Zoroastrianism survived Alexander. It survived the Seleucids. It survived the Parthians, though they were Iranian. It survived the Sasanian period and the Arab conquest and the millennium that followed. And it is practiced today by communities in Iran and by the Parsi community in India. Descendants of the Zoroastrians who emigrated from Iran in the 8th to 10th centuries CE to preserve their faith. In temples where a sacred fire has been burning continuously for 1,500 years. The longest fire in the world. The word paradise survived. Old Persian perideitza, meaning a walled garden, was borrowed into Greek as paradisos, into Latin as paradisus, into Old French as paradis, into English as paradise. Every time you use that word for a beach, for a restaurant, for the afterlife, for a perfect afternoon, for anything, you are speaking Persian. You are carrying a small piece of the Achaemenid world forward through time without knowing it. It cost the Persians nothing to give you that word. They gave it to the languages of their empire, and it traveled, and it kept traveling, and it is still traveling. The postal system survived as an idea. The Roman Empire would later build its cursus publicus, its official courier network, with such obvious structural similarities to the Persian relay system that it is impossible to believe the designers were not aware of the model. Herodotus's description of the Persian couriers would travel through the centuries and arrive on the facade of the New York General Post Office in 1914. The concept of a government-maintained relay system for rapid communication across a large territory is, in its intellectual lineage, a Persian invention. The administrative model survived, and somewhere in the long chain of Greek merchants who came after Menesarchus of Sardis, moving goods along what had been the Persian trade network through Anatolia and the Levant, the new administrators would find that the roads still went where the roads had always gone, and that the relay stations were still standing, and that the local merchants still spoke Aramaic at the official level and their own language at home, and that the tariff structure, whatever name it operated under now, was still organized along lines that looked remarkably familiar. The Seleucid successors of Alexander in the eastern territories governed through satrapies by another name. The Parthians, who replaced the Seleucids in Iran, beginning in 247 BCE, were explicitly Iranian in cultural identity and Persian in administrative practice. The Sasanian Empire, which replaced the Parthians and ruled Iran from 224 to 651 CE, explicitly claimed the Achaemenid legacy. Ardashir I, the Sasanian founder, framed his rule as the restoration of the Persian imperial tradition that Alexander had interrupted. They called themselves Shahanshah, King of Kings, the same title that Cyrus and Darius had used. The title traveled another 12 centuries. The concept of tolerant governance survived, diffused, and transformed in every subsequent empire that found itself ruling diverse populations and had to decide what to do about the diversity. The Ottoman millet system, which allowed religious minorities to govern themselves under their own law within the Ottoman administrative framework, is its distant and complicated descendant. The Roman approach to provincial governance, preserve local law, religion, and custom, demand tribute, military service, and political loyalty, follows the Achaemenid model so closely that it is difficult to believe the similarity is accidental rather than transmitted. Datiya's extra ration, Artabaza's careful tablet, Bagabigna's fire altar in the mountain courtyard, Shirin's pragmatic management of one administration following another. The Persian Empire built something that burned easily and lasted forever. And the thing that lasted was never the gold. Alexander took that in 11 years. But the ideas, the words, the small practices of organized human kindness embedded in the administrative record and carried forward in the languages and institutions of every civilization that followed. The fire they couldn't take was the one that was never in the building. Let's be quiet now. The Royal Road, all 2,700 kilometers of it, from Susa on the Shur River to Sardis on the Aegean coast, outlasted the empire that built it by centuries. The road itself, the physical road, the leveled grade, and the relay stations, and the bridges over the river crossings, and the roadside caravanserais, remained in use through the Seleucid period, and the Parthian period, and into the Roman era, when it was absorbed into the Roman road network that connected the same territories under a different name and a different administrative language, because the mountain passes were where they had always been, and the river crossings were where they had always been, and the human need to move across vast distances had not changed and was not going to change. You are lying in the dark somewhere, and you are very far from Persepolis, and you are very far from the mountain villages of the Zagros range, where the fire altars burned in the courtyards of farmers who served in the empire's armies and came home and tended their flame. You are far from the markets of Babylon, where Shirin sold her dates, and far from the writing room, where Artabaza bent over his clay tablets with his aching back, and far from the high limestone platform where Datia received her ration, and the priests tended their fire before the workers arrived each morning. And yet, here is the thing about time and distance. They do not actually remove you from those places as completely as they seem to. The word paradise is in the room with you right now, if you want to use it. The concept of a relay postal system moved with every letter that has traveled from sender to recipient for 2,500 years. The model of governing diverse peoples with a light administrative touch rather than forced cultural replacement is an idea that is still being argued about in parliaments and courts and policy offices in the present day. And the argument has Persian fingerprints on it, even when nobody in the argument knows the history. There is something specifically worth sitting with in the late night hours, which these are for you, wherever you are, however you've arranged yourself, about the persistence of small things. The enormous things go. The palace is open to the sky now. The road is under asphalt. The columns lie on their sides in the highland dust of Iran. Still beautiful, still enormous, still watched over by nothing but the weather. The enormous things had the lifespan of the enormous things, which is measured in centuries and is impressive and is also finite. The small things go further. A word for a garden, a practice of tending fire, the administrative instinct that workers deserve to have their circumstances noted in the record, that Datia, after her child's birth, should receive more, that this was worth writing down, that the humanity of the people doing the work was worth tracking, even if only in numbers. These travel in a different medium, a less visible medium, through language, through institutional memory, through the slow inheritance of one civilization's practices by the next. And they go further than stone. The empire carved everything in stone because stone seemed like the surest way to last. And the stone is mostly still there. At Persepolis, on the bare Iranian plateau, the carved reliefs of the tribute processions still facing forward on their staircases, the double-headed bull capitals still looking outward from the fallen columns, the relief at Bisitun still showing Darius with his foot on the defeated impostor and the 19 rebel kings in their chain, 15 meters up on the cliff face in the mountain pass. The stone weathers, the stone remains, but the most durable things are not the stone. They are the word in the language, the fire in the temple, the principle in the administrative record, the name of a woman on a ration tablet that says, "She was here, she worked, she gave birth, she received what she needed," and someone thought to write it down. There is a fire burning in a temple in the city of Ayazd, in the Ayazd province of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that has been maintained continuously for at least 1,500 years, and possibly longer. Its original flame, by Zoroastrian tradition, was lit sometime in the 5th century CE, though the lineage of sacred fire that it continues goes back much further. The priests tend it. They add fuel at specific intervals. They perform the prayers. The fire has survived the Arab conquest of the 7th century. It has survived the long centuries of Islamic rule, during which Zoroastrianism was marginalized, but not extinguished in its homeland. It is still burning now, tonight, while you are lying in the dark, thinking about the Persian Empire and its paradise gardens and its royal road and the 40 million people who lived their ordinary lives inside the world's first superpower and went to bed at night in their own small darkness. The flame doesn't know about empires. It just burns. And that is, perhaps, the most Persian thing about it. The road goes somewhere still. The word stays in the language. The fire in the temple is tended by someone tonight, as it has been tended every night for 1,500 years. And behind that 1,500 years is another set of flames, and another set of tenders going back further, back through the centuries to a courtyard in the Zagros mountains, where a man named Bagabigna added fuel to a stone altar in the early morning before the work of the day began, and further back through the generations of Achaemenid priests and Persian farmers and the deep, unrecorded past of a people who had decided, long before anyone made them kings, that the most important thing you could do was keep a light burning in the dark. They were right. They were absolutely right. And the keeping of it, the small daily act of tending the thing that matters, of not letting it go out, of doing the unglamorous maintenance that continuity requires, is as true now as it was in the foothills of the Zagros range in the 6th century BCE, and as true in whatever room you are in right now as it was in Persepolis. The empire is gone. The flame is not. The people who built the Persian Empire were not the kings in the end. Or rather, the kings were the frame, and the people were the picture, and the picture was Datia with her extra ration, and her child she kept working to feed, and Artabaza with his aching back, and his careful clay, and the records he filled every day, without knowing they would matter for 25 centuries. And Bagabigna, in his courtyard with his flame and his goats and his quiet morning prayers. They were not exceptional people. They were just people, living their lives inside the largest structure the world had yet produced, carrying their ordinary weight of days. What they made was not a monument. It was a world. And the world, like all worlds, was impermanent, taken by fire and by a young Macedonian king who was too brilliant and too impatient and too everything. And yet the ideas that organized that world, the principles that made it function, the small word for a beautiful garden that traveled through 20 languages across 2,500 years. Those are still here. The empire ended. The empire is still happening. You are in your bed now, and the room is dark, the way rooms are dark at the end of a long night, and the world outside is doing whatever it is doing. The sounds of wherever you are in the world drifting in soft through the walls, familiar and close. The Persian Empire is 2,500 years gone. Its road is under asphalt. Its palace is open to the sky. And in a fire temple in Yazd, on this same night, the flame is burning. The same flame, the same tradition, the same small, careful act of keeping the light going that Bagabigna performed in his mountain courtyard, and the temple priests performed at Persepolis, and the priests perform tonight in their fire temple in the highland air of Iran. Let the kings and the battles and the great campaigns recede into the background hum of the past, where they have always been. What remains is smaller and more true, that someone kept the fire going, that Datia received what she needed, that the road went where it went, that the word for a walled garden, a beautiful protected place, a piece of the world kept safe inside walls, that word traveled with the language until it reached you. You are in your own small paradise now, dark and warm and yours. Sleep well. The flame is tended.